this week's edition of Maryland Talk, where Maryland students meet world news. My name's Keith Solomon, and I'm your host. On this week's edition of Maryland Talk, we'll be discussing the BP oil spill, which occurred about a year ago to date. On April 20th, 2010, an explosion occurred at the Deepwater Horizon oil rig, which was operated by British Petroleum. The explosion not only killed a dozen oil workers, but it also spilled millions of barrels of oil into the Gulf of Mexico. Let's take a look back on the Gulf oil spill with the year in news.
Where today, BP launched an ambitious effort to plug the hole that for more than 5 weeks has been gushing oil into the ocean. We do not yet know if this procedure, called a top kill, will work. What we do know is that whether or not BP stops this oil flow, the damage to the landscape and wildlife is beyond devastation.
As the sun rose above the Gulf of Mexico, all eyes were fixated on what was happening below its surface. For 5 weeks, that broken well pipe 5,000 feet down has been spewing oil into the Gulf. Early this morning, BP technicians and engineers were preparing their best shot at stopping it. A while later, we joined Kathy Norman's brother Don, a wildlife biologist and toxicologist, as he set out to do an assessment of the bird population on the Wisner lands. At this time of year, there are more than 50 different species of birds here.
There's 2 semi-palmated plovers.
As we arrived at the beach, a work team overseen by the Army Corps of Engineers was scrambling to block a breach so that oil wouldn't enter the fragile marshlands. It is already too late.
What does this oil mean for these birds?
It means that it's very likely that most of these birds that are oiled will not survive. Now, if the bird has actually been feeding in the water that's got oil in it, or has oil in the organisms that it's eating, it could be ingesting oil either on or in the organisms it's eating.
For 10 years, Don Norman has been doing a census of the birds here. He's watched the population recover from the havoc of Hurricanes Katrina and Gustav. But for the last month, he has been waiting and wondering if BP's spewing oil well represents an even bigger threat.
That there's quite a bit of oil back
All
on
this
these.
brown stain here.
Yeah, and you can see it on all back in these marsh areas.
You've got to be a pretty strong optimist to think it's not going to get any worse.
I think it's going to be a long and ugly event.
This evening, the images from below look much the same. BP holds a news conference to say,
"We expect these activities to be complete sometime over the next 24 hours, but I would stress that this could take longer."
And so, as the moon rose over the Gulf of Mexico tonight, it was not clear what tomorrow would bring. I'm Jeffrey Kaufman for Nightline in Port Fourchon, Louisiana.
The Gulf oil spill ended up lasting 23 weeks in total. Consequently, the wildlife effects are now irreversible. We'll now head to some expert Maryland students via webcam to discuss the environmental implications of the spill.
See, a lot of us have seen the damage by looking at the surface of the ocean, but there's just a lot more going on underneath. Like, one major problem was neutral buoyancy. Oil is usually lighter, so it's supposed to float, but in this instance, some of the oil just doesn't reach the surface. There were dispersants that were placed in the water to break them apart, but it brings up the oxygen level problem. And then more inland, erosion started in various islands because the oil it weakened the soil for the plants and trees. And then the oil infected the marshes in Louisiana, 2 areas in Louisiana. It's not as vast as the Gulf, but the damage has affected so much wildlife. It's just unfortunate, like, how much damage is done. People can even smell the oil from miles away. They blocked up the beaches because there was just so much slick getting washed on the shore.
The oil spill in the Gulf drastically affected the immediate communities and businesses surrounding the Gulf of Mexico. The effects were felt in both offshore and onshore industries such as fishing and tourism. For some groups of people, fishing has been their main source of livelihood for generations. Additionally, the fishing industry in the Gulf of Mexico contributes to roughly 20% of all fish and seafood produced in the United States. Even before the oil spill, the fisherman business was starting to dwindle. This catastrophe only worsens the situation by forcing many individuals into unemployment. With the failing fish industry and increase of oil in the water, attraction to the surrounding areas suffered. People used to come to the Gulf of Mexico for the beaches and seafood. However, many of these beaches have been closed because the water is simply too toxic for living beings. As for cleanup, many measures have been taken to remove oil and dispose of it, but nothing seems to be fast enough for the public. BP's short-term cleanup plan was to lower shut-off valves to the ocean floor, and that would stop one of the 3 active leaks on the sea level.
Animals such as sea otters and birds use their fur and feathers to keep warm. When these animals become covered in oil, they cannot insulate properly, and many of them contract hypothermia. Larger animals, such as whales, consume the oil by eating it off the skins of shrimp and kelp, resulting in indigestion and diarrhea. Sea turtles and other animals, who usually avoid oil in the water, have found that their nesting and feeding grounds have been completely covered by oil and now have no place else to go. Water mammals, such as dolphins, who need to surface for air, have been inhaling the oil, and many now have oil in their lungs.
Thank you for joining us on this week's edition of Maryland Talk. Please be sure to join us next week when we discuss the health benefits of sporkle. Thank you, and have a good day.